From the moment he was born, life never gave him a fair chance. His name was Daniel Carter, and he grew up in the poorest part of the city, where crime was as common as the air people breathed. His mother was addicted to drugs, his father was never around, and the only people who looked out for him were the local gang members. By the time he was 10, he had already learned that the world was a cruel place, and survival meant doing whatever it took. As a child, Daniel longed for stability, but it was nowhere to be found. His home was a small, broken-down apartment filled with the scent of cigarette smoke and alcohol. His mother barely noticed whether he was home or not. School was never a priority. In fact, it was more of an escape from the chaos at home. But even there, he struggled. Teachers dismissed him as a lost cause, and classmates avoided him because of his rough appearance and unpredictable temper. At 12, he started running small errands for a local gang. At first, it was nothing major, delivering packages, passing messages, standing watch while the older guys handled their business. The gang became his family, the streets became his home, and crime became his way of life. The first time he held a gun, he felt a twisted sense of power, a feeling he had never known before his first crime and arrest. By the time he turned 15, Daniel had committed his first major crime. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, just a simple robbery. He and 2 other gang members had planned to steal from a small convenience store. The plan was quick: get in, grab the cash, and get out. But things never go as planned. That night, adrenaline rushed through Daniel's veins as they entered the store. The cashier, an old man with tired eyes, looked at them with fear. Daniel pointed the gun at him, just as he had been taught, demanding the money. But the old man hesitated. Panic set in. One of Daniel's accomplices lost his patience and fired a shot. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. The old man collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, sirens wailed in the distance. The 3 boys ran, but Daniel didn't make it far. The police cornered him in an alley, his hands still shaking from the gun's weight. He was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged away. His first time in prison. Sitting in the back of the police car, reality hit him like a ton of bricks. He was no longer a boy playing a dangerous game. He was a criminal. The trial was swift, the evidence clear. At 15, he was sentenced to life in prison. The first night in his cell was the longest night of his life. The walls felt like they were closing in. The silence was unbearable, and the fear of what awaited him consumed him. He was just a kid, but in prison, no one cared about age. The moment Daniel Carter stepped into prison, he knew his life was over. At just 15 years old, he was thrown into a world where weakness meant death, and trust was a currency no one could afford. The walls were cold, the air smelled of sweat and despair, and the eyes of hardened criminals followed him like vultures circling their prey. Harsh punishments, prison rules, and internal politics. Prison was a brutal machine designed to break men, and Daniel was just a boy caught in its gears. The rules were simple: obey the guards, keep your head down, and never show fear. But inside, there were unwritten laws far more dangerous than the ones in the rulebook. Gangs controlled everything: who ate first, who got protection, who lived, and who didn't. Punishment for breaking these rules was swift and merciless. If a prisoner disrespected the wrong person, he could end up beaten, stabbed, or worse. The guards, hardened by years of dealing with murderers and gangsters, had little patience for troublemakers. Solitary confinement, beatings, and extended sentences were common punishments. Daniel learned the hard way. On his first week, he made the mistake of not looking away when a senior gang member was talking. Within seconds, he was grabbed, slammed against the metal bars, and warned never to disrespect his superiors. The message was clear: he had to find protection, or he wouldn't last long. Relationships with other prisoners and guards. At first, Daniel tried to stay alone, but in prison, isolation was a death sentence. He needed allies. A man named Reggie, an old inmate who had spent 30 years behind bars, took him under his wing. Reggie wasn't kind, but he was fair. He taught Daniel the basics of survival: never take more than you can handle, never start a fight you can't win, and always know who's watching. The guards were a different story. Some treated prisoners like animals, using any excuse to unleash violence. Others were indifferent, doing only what their job required. But a few, like Officer Martinez, saw something in Daniel. "You're too young for this place," Martinez once told him. "Don't let it turn you into something worse." But words meant little in a place where actions determined everything. How he learned to survive and adapt over time, Daniel toughened up. He worked out daily, making himself stronger so no one would see him as an easy target. He learned to read people, who could be trusted, who was dangerous, and who was looking for their next victim. Most importantly, he understood that prison wasn't just about physical survival, it was a mental game. He read books when he could, learning about law, history, and even philosophy. He stopped reacting to insults, kept his emotions buried, and learned to play the long game years past. And Daniel was no longer the scared boy who had entered those walls. He had become something else, something darker, something more dangerous. Prison hadn't broken him. It had shaped him into a survivor. Psychological and emotional transformation. Prison had taken everything from Daniel, his youth, his freedom, and any hope of a normal life. But as the years passed, he realized that the most dangerous prison wasn't the one made of concrete and steel. It was the one inside his mind. How his mindset changed over time. At 15, Daniel was just a scared boy trying to survive. He had entered prison angry at the world, believing he was doomed to rot behind bars. For years that anger fueled him, making him reckless, violent, and ready to fight at the slightest provocation. But with time, the rage faded, replaced by a deep, numbing emptiness. He saw men who had been locked up for decades, hardened criminals who had given up hope, living like ghosts in a forgotten world. He realized he was becoming one of them. If he didn't change, prison wouldn't just be his home, it would consume him completely. The first step was acceptance. He stopped blaming others for his situation and started looking inward. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. But did that mean he had to be the same person forever? Attempts to educate himself or learn a skill. The prison library became his sanctuary. At first, he only picked up books to pass the time, but soon he found himself drawn to stories of people who had rebuilt their lives. He read about law, philosophy, and self-improvement. For the first time, he questioned everything, his past, his choices, and his future. He also started taking educational programs offered in the prison. He learned basic math, history, and even began studying for a GED. It was slow progress, but every new thing he learned made him feel like he was reclaiming a piece of himself. Reggie, the older inmate who had once taught him how to survive, noticed the change. "Reading won't get you out of here," he warned, "but it might stop this place from getting inside you." Daniel also found a new skill, writing. He started keeping a journal, pouring out his thoughts, frustrations, and dreams. Writing gave him an outlet, a way to process emotions he had buried for years, dreaming of freedom and trying to become a better person. For the longest time, Daniel never thought about freedom. Life outside felt like a distant dream, something that belonged to another person. But as he grew older, the idea of walking under the open sky, breathing fresh air, and living without bars became an obsession. He knew he couldn't erase his past, but he wanted to be more than just a prisoner. He started mentoring younger inmates, warning them against making the same mistakes he did. He tried to stay out of trouble, avoid fights, and prove, at least to himself, that he was more than the crime that had defined him. Still, one question haunted him. If he ever got out, would the world give him a second chance, or was he destined to be a prisoner forever, even outside these walls, the outside world and the weight of the past? As the years turned into decades, Daniel Carter became a man unrecognizable from the reckless teenager who had entered prison. His body was covered in scars, some from fights, others from moments of despair. His mind, once consumed by anger, was now shaped by the harsh reality of life behind bars. He had grown, learned, and even changed, but one question lingered. Did any of it matter? There any chance of release, or is he destined to stay in prison forever? Daniel had been sentenced to life, but over the years, laws changed. New policies on prison reform and rehabilitation programs gave him a sliver of hope. His good behavior, years of study, and mentorship to younger inmates were taken into account when his case was reviewed for parole. The day of his parole hearing arrived, and for the first time in decades, he sat before a board of people who held his fate in their hands. They asked him about his past, his regrets, and his future plans. He spoke honestly about his guilt, his transformation, and his desire to contribute to the world beyond prison walls. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came. Parole granted. For the first time in 40 years, he was going home. But where was home? How would his family, friends, or society react if he were released? Walking out of prison, Daniel felt the weight of freedom in a way he never imagined. The air was different, the sky seemed wider, and the world had moved on without him. He had been locked up in a time when payphones lined the streets. Now people stared at glowing screens in their hands. He searched for his family, but they were gone. His mother had died years ago, and the few relatives he had left wanted nothing to do with him. To them, he was a ghost of a past they had long buried. Society wasn't much kinder. To the outside world, he wasn't Daniel Carter. He was a murderer, a criminal, an ex-convict. Employers refused to hire him, landlords wouldn't rent to him, and everywhere he went, people looked at him with suspicion. Freedom wasn't what he had imagined. It was another kind of prison, one without walls, but just as isolating. The only person who showed him kindness was Officer Martinez, the guard who had once told him he was too young for this life. Now retired, Martinez helped him find a halfway house, a place where ex-prison tried to rebuild their lives. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Has he truly changed, or is he still haunted by his past? Daniel had spent years trying to become a better person, but could he ever escape the shadow of his past? Nightmares of his crime still haunted him. The face of the old man he had robbed, the sound of the gunshot that changed everything, it never left him. The temptation to fall back into old habits was strong. Some days he felt like giving up, believing society would never accept him. But then he reminded himself of the promise he had made, to prove he was more than his worst mistake. One evening, he sat on a park bench, watching children laugh and play. He realized something. He would never be free from his past, but he could choose what to do with his future. And for the first time in a long time, he believed he still had a chance. Daniel Carter had spent most of his life behind bars. Whether in prison or out in the world, he carried the weight of his past everywhere he went. His freedom had not come with a fresh start, only a different kind of isolation. If he is released, can he start a new life? Life outside prison was not what he had imagined. The world had moved on without him, and no one was waiting for his return. Society saw him as a criminal, a man who had committed an unforgivable crime, no matter how much time had passed or how much he had changed. But Daniel refused to let his past define him. He took a job no one else wanted, cleaning streets, collecting garbage, doing the work that went unnoticed. Day by day, he rebuilt himself, not for others, but for himself. He volunteered at shelters, mentored troubled youth, and tried to steer them away from the path he had once walked. One day, while sweeping the sidewalk in front of a grocery store, a boy approached him. "Are you the man who used to be in prison?" he asked, hesitation in his voice. Daniel nodded. "Then why do you clean the streets?" Daniel looked at him and smiled. "Because I can't erase my past, but I can try to make the world a little better than I left it." It wasn't the life he had dreamed of, but it was a life he had chosen, and for the first time in decades, he felt like he had a purpose. If he remains in prison, what will his final wish be? But what if Daniel never got out? What if parole was denied, and he was forced to live the rest of his days behind bars, just another forgotten name in the prison system? If that had been his fate, Daniel would not have fought it. He would have accepted that some mistakes cannot be undone, some sins cannot be forgiven. But even in his final days, he would have held on to one thing. Hope his final wish would not have been for himself. It would have been for the young prisoners, the ones who still had a chance. He would have asked for his books, his letters, his journals, all the knowledge he had gained, to be passed down to the ones who needed them most. And on the night of his death, as the cold air settled into his cell, he would have closed his eyes with a quiet thought. Even in the darkest places, change is possible. Even in a cage, a man can still be free. A powerful, emotional, or shocking ending in the end, Daniel's story wasn't just about crime or punishment. It was about the choices we make after we've lost everything. Whether in the outside world or behind bars, he had learned one undeniable truth. Redemption is not about forgetting the past. It's about deciding what to do with the time we have left.